Once upon a time, there was a man named John who lived alone in a small, dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. He had always been a solitary person, but he had never been truly alone until his wife and children had been killed in a car accident. The loss had been too much for him to bear, and he had retreated to the woods to escape the memories and the constant pain. John spent his days wandering through the forest, lost in his own thoughts and drowning in his grief. He rarely spoke to anyone and never left the woods. He had become a ghost of a man, consumed by his misery and despair. One day, while out on a walk, John stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It was smaller than his own cabin and in even worse condition, but something about it called out to him. He couldn't explain why, but he felt compelled to enter. Once inside, John was immediately struck by the sense of unease that permeated the air. The cabin was dark and musty, and it felt as though it hadn't been inhabited in years. He began to explore, but the more he looked around, the more uneasy he felt. It was as if something was watching him, something that he couldn't see but could feel all around him. John quickly became convinced that the cabin was haunted, and he was filled with dread at the thought of spending another night there. But he couldn't bring himself to leave, not yet. That night, John lay awake in his bed, listening to the creaking of the old cabin and the howling of the wind outside. He was sure that he could hear something moving around in the darkness, something that was getting closer and closer to his bed. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the foot of his bed, a dark, shadowy figure that seemed to be made of smoke. John screamed and bolted upright, but the figure was already upon him. It wrapped its cold, clammy arms around him and dragged him down into the darkness. John awoke the next morning, lying in his bed with no memory of what had happened the night before. But he could still feel the cold embrace of the figure and knew that it had been no dream. He was terrified and knew he had to leave the cabin as soon as possible. But something was holding him back. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if something was drawing him deeper into the darkness. John's descent into madness had only just begun, and the horrors that awaited him in the haunted cabin were beyond anything he could have imagined. Will John be able to escape the haunted cabin, or will he forever be trapped in its grasp? Find out in the next episode of The Lonely Man's Tragic Life.